Carol and Neil's wedding was 2 weeks away. They weren't planning a big celebration, just inviting friends and family to a local church, and the reception was going to be held in the hall of the local Veterans Society, which was run by Carol's father and who had given permission to use the hall. Neil's bachelor party and Carol's bachelorette party were planned for Saturday, a week before the wedding. The couple was excited about the upcoming celebration and parties in their honor. The next 2 weeks were hectic and wild. The night of partying was exciting, carefully planned, and a great experience for all involved. Everyone got so drunk that they spent the entire Sunday afternoon with a hangover. The women spent the night and Sunday at Carol's house, while the men spent the night in a hotel room, mostly lying on the floor. Monday turned out to be a difficult working day for everyone. The wedding day has arrived. Carol was at home. Her mother and aunt helped her get ready. She was going to go to church with the dress in its case and change there. She was so excited that she was on the verge of vomiting. Her mother gave her some crackers to snack on while she waited. It helped, but not much. Then her mother offered her tea with honey. It really helped. Of course, her mother didn't tell Carol about the shot of bourbon she put in her tea. By the time they got to the church, Carol was already half drunk. She laughed and giggled at everything. Her mother took her aside and told her to sit while she drank her hot coffee. By the time Carol had to go out into the hall, she was almost sober. She was still giggling, remembering all the funny things that had happened in the last 4 weeks. Her father, all handsome in a tuxedo, stood waiting for her as she hurried towards him. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you, Daddy," Carol said. "You're a welcome doll. I love you, and I'm glad to do this for you and Neil." "He's lucky to have a girl like you," her father said. "Thank you, Daddy. I feel lucky. I have Neil. He's just wonderful." "I'm just glad you're happy, Angel," Carol's father said. Carol smiled at him, nodding. She giggled again, remembering her bachelorette party. Then her face took on a frightened expression. Her father looked at her. "What happened, Pumpkin?" he asked. "Nothing, Daddy, nothing. I just remembered something, but I think Betty has it all sorted out." "Oh, okay," he replied, nodding. Weddings were not his forte. He just walked down the aisle with his daughter in his arms, and his wife sat in the pew, hoping he wouldn't screw it up. Inside, Carol was almost in a panic. She just remembered what happened at her bachelorette party, and she sure as hell didn't want Neil to find out about it. She really hoped that none of the girls would spill the beans at the reception. The music started, and she and her father walked slowly down the aisle. Everyone looked at her and gasped. She put her brightest smile on her face as she started walking. She held it throughout the ceremony. Carol and Neil wrote their own vows. Carol started first. She repeated them slowly, smiling so widely that her face began to hurt. When she finished, she began to cry. Neil, like a true gentleman, handed her his handkerchief. She carefully dabbed her eyes, looking into the eyes of her future husband. Neil then began to say his vows. He was also in no hurry and seemed to be trying to pronounce them very correctly and confidently. He even highlighted some words so people could understand them. The priest then asked if there was anyone who objected to this marriage. Nobody spoke. The priest then asked Carol if she would take Neil to be her lawful husband. "Yes," she answered loudly. The priest then asked Neil if he would take Carol to be his lawful wife. Neil stood looking at Carol. Carol watched as Neil's face went through a variety of emotions. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that looked like a TV remote control. Carol began to shake. She knew. She just knew what would happen next. Neil pressed a button on the remote control, and the 2 huge televisions above the pulpit lit up. The image finally cleared up to show 2 people having sex. The sound turned up at full volume. "Oh God, Steve, oh God, you're having sex with your best friend." It was Carol's voice. Then everyone gasped as Neil turned and punched Stephen Adams square in the face. Stephen fell and Neil hit him in the face, and then between the legs. Neil turned to the priest. "No," he answered his question. Carol lay on the floor and cried. Her bridesmaid spat at her. The rest of the bridesmaids now surrounded her to protect her from the maid of honor. "You don't deserve a man like Neil, bitch," Betty screamed at her. The people in the pews now stood up, trying to see what was happening ahead. The priest retreated from everyone in the wedding procession. Neil just stood there, looking down at Carol. "How could you do this to me? I know we weren't married yet, but we swore to be faithful to each other when I gave you my grandmother's engagement ring. By the way, I need him back, bitch." Neil reached through the women around Carol, grabbed her finger, and removed his grandmother's ring. Carol screamed, knowing she had ruined her life. The video continued to play on televisions. Everyone saw Carol asking Stephen to take her. It was only a 10-second snippet, but it played over and over again. Stephen began to rise. Neil hit him again. Not hard, but enough to make him fall back to the floor. "Stay there, you piece of shit," Neil shouted. Turning to Carol, Neil simply looked at her. She looked at him. "Why?" Neil asked. "We really need to talk about this," Carol said. "No, no need. Do you want me to show the rest of the video to your friends and family?" "God, no. Please don't," she begged. "So why?" Neil shouted. "I was drunk. I am so sorry. So sorry." Neil shook his head, turned and walked slowly down the aisle and out of the church. His 3 groomsmen followed him. Neil got into the limousine waiting outside, followed by his 3 friends. The 2 stayed with Stephen. They were also in the video with Carol. The last one to enter was Betty, Carol's best friend. She was Carol's only unmarried friend. The rest were married and sat on the bride's side. Stephen, Bill, and Mark had wives sitting on the groom's side. Right now, their wives were receiving videos of their husbands having Carol on their phones. The 2 bridesmaids' husbands also received videos of their wives engaged sex with 3 groomsmen. Why should only Neil suffer? Driver, at the Marriott on. "I know what you mean, sir," the driver replied. The 5 of them entered the Marriott and went up to the room Neil had reserved for him and Carol. There was champagne, wine, and food. The 5 of them had a good time, getting drunk and eating food that Carol's father paid for. "What are you going to do with this?" "Eat," Jim said, pointing to the wedding gifts stacked on the table at the other end of the room. "Damn, I don't care, but I think the best thing to do is bring them back, so just leave them alone." "You know, Carol will come here someday to get her luggage," Betty said. "Yes, I know, and I can't wait to be alone with her." "You're not going to hurt her, are you?" asked Betty. After all, Carol was her best friend. Well, she was until today. "No, I won't give her the pleasure of throwing me in jail." "Well done," Betty said, taking another sip from the bottle of champagne. There was a knock on the door. Neil looked at Betty. Betty looked at Neil and shrugged. Neil shrugged, stood up and walked towards the door. Opening it, he stepped back. The body hit him in the chest. Female body. She screamed. It was Carol's mother. "You fucking bastard! How dare you embarrass my daughter like that?" she shouted from the floor. Rising to her feet, she lunged at Neil once more. He walked around her. She landed on the bed. She lay there and cried. Neil just looked at the poor woman. Jim walked over and closed the door. Neil walked over and sat on the bed next to Carol's mother. "Mrs. Kelly, I'm sorry you're embarrassed, but it wasn't me who did it. It was your daughter on TV, not me." Mrs. Away, Kelly rolled over and sat up. She looked at Neil, who shook his head. "But you could do it in private, not all of our friends." "What? It turned out that your daughter is easily accessible." "Oh, Neil, as far as I know, she has never done anything like this." Mrs. Kelly. "Beth, please." "Beth, then you don't know your own daughter," Neil said. "What do you mean?" Beth asked. "Betty?" Beth, I've been Carol's best friend since 5th grade. She's been like this since her first year of high school. At any party I was at with her, but she always found a way to get drunk. Then she was the biggest bitch there, and, well, the guys were lining up." "Oh my God." "Beth," Neil said, "Carol needs help." Betty tried to convince her to talk to someone about her drinking, but she refused. She's been abstaining from alcohol since we got engaged, but I guess her bachelorette party. Well, you know what happened, and I wondered where my so-called friends were that night, and I soon found out. But who? Who gave you this video? Beth asked. I played Mrs. Kelly, Betty said. But you're her best friend? But I'm also Neil's friend, and I let him down. I failed Carol too. But she knowingly broke the promise she made to me and the even greater promise she made to Neil. My God. Beth was crying again. Neil pulled her towards him and hugged her. He always thought Beth was a wonderful woman. He really liked her and didn't want to do what he did to embarrass her. He hated himself for it. But he was not going to marry her. He was going to marry her daughter, who turned out to be slutty. Perhaps if he had been told in advance about her tendency to be like this when she was drinking, he could have helped her, or at least given her some help. But no one told him that she was behaving inappropriately when drunk. Since they started dating, neither of them has drank alcohol. As far as he knew, she was a normal young woman. Yes, they did have sex on the second date, but Neil thought it was normal. He had many second dates where he had sex with the young girl he was with. Now old man Carroll stood in front of him. He was angry. He turned to Betty and frowned. She pushed him away. He turned away. He looked at Neil intently. Neil just shook his head, hugging his wife, who was still crying. Do you know what you did? Henry Kelly asked Neil. You? Yes. She cheated on me before we got married. What? Don't you think she would cheat on me after she married me? Neil growled. Henry turned and walked to the window, looking out at the world. The silence was interrupted by another knock on the door. Betty rolled her eyes and went to open the door. She guessed who it would be. She opened the door. Damn, bitch, what are you doing here? Carol screamed. Fuck you, bitch. I told you to tell him, but Niwu, you said you could control yourself. You stupid fool, Betty shouted back. Betty walked to the edge of the bed and sat down next to Neil. Neil put his other arm around her. Carol walked slowly into the room. Jim closed the door, throwing the bolt. Neil, Carol said quietly. Neil ignored her. Niall, please, please, please. Please, what bitch? Neil growled. Beth began another round of tears. Betty took a deep breath, as if answering her best friend. Neil, squeezing her, prevented her from saying anything. Can we talk, please? I love you so much. Yeah, I saw how much you loved me while you were having sex with Steve, Neil growled. Beth shuddered and leaned on him. Mom, why don't you and Dad go? And what? Shame on our cheating daughter? Beth screamed, still crying. Beth, Henry shouted. Fuck you, Beth shouted back. Henry turned and walked towards his wife with anger in his eyes. Neil stood up and stood between Henry and Beth. He'd be damned if he'd let him hit or hurt his wife. Henry stopped, looking at Neil. Neil felt Beth stand behind him. She put her hands on his hips and pushed him aside. Move over, Neil, Beth said. I'm not afraid of him. He knows what will happen if he ever hits me again. Carol gasped. Beth was definitely standing still. Henry looked like he was going to hit her. Jim and Jason stood next to Neil. Beth walked over to Henry, looking at him. Go ahead, Beth said, clenching her fists. Henry took a step back. He turned back to the window, visibly relaxing. Beth turned to Neil. She looked into his eyes. You would have stopped him from hitting me. I can see it in your eyes. Thank you. I knew you were a good person, Beth said, hugging Neil tightly and kissing him on the lips. Mother, Carol exclaimed. Beth continued to kiss Neil until he kissed back. When his arms wrapped around her, she pulled away. He let her go, but winked at her with that eye that no one except Betty saw. Beth blushed and nodded slightly. Turning, she walked up to her daughter and hit her. You stupid bitch, Beth screamed. Couldn't even last one more night? You are the stupidest, horniest bitch I have ever raised. Don't you dare go home. Perhaps Neil, out of the kindness of his heart, will allow you to stay here for the night. I doubt it, but maybe if you get drunk, he'll give you pity sex. With these words, Beth quickly walked to the door and opened it, turning to her husband. Are you coming, asshole? She screamed. Henry turned around, his face full of anger. Neil stepped towards him. "You touch her, and I'll come for you," Neil said quietly. Henry winced. He didn't look at Neil, but nodded, then joined his wife in the hallway, closing the door behind him. "Jim, Jason, could you give me and Carol some?" "No problem, buddy," Jim said. "Jane has already called twice asking where I am. I told her to go home." Jason looked confused, shrugged, and hurried to catch up with Jim. "Do you want me to leave?" asked Betty. "No, I may need a witness." Betty nodded and sat down on the bed. "And now to you," Neil said. "I could beat you, but you know that I don't beat women. So, unless you're going to hit me, get up and go change." "I don't want you to ruin this beautiful dress," Neil said. "And you too, Betty. Go get changed." Neil sat down on the bed. Carol stood up slowly and picked up one of the bags on the floor. Betty took another bag. Both women disappeared into the huge bathroom of the suite. Neil took a t-shirt and shorts from his bag. He planned to spend the rest of the day and night in comfort. He was already dressed and standing by the window when the women came out of the bathroom. Betty was wearing a t-shirt and shorts. Carol put on a blouse and skirt. The skirt reached just below the knees. Neil turned, looking at both of them. Both were very attractive. Of the two, Carol was the slimmer. Betty was a little overweight. Not much, but a little. Betty had more breasts than Carol. Their faces were simply adorable. Carol was a brunette and Betty was a blonde. And Neil preferred redheads, like Carol's mother. In fact, Carol had red hair, but she dyed it dark brown. Everyone thought her natural color was brown when she grew them out. She didn't have freckles like redheads. Betty had freckles. Not much, but a light scattering on the nose. "What should we do with you now?" Neil began, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. "I'll open it," he said. He knew that these were most likely the bridesmaids coming to get their things. Opening the door, he saw 5 girls looking at him with hope. They smiled when they saw Neil, but frowned when they saw Betty. Okay, one at a time. Take your bags and leave." "Can't we change clothes?" asked Lucy. "No," Neil shouted. Cold. "Wait, Lucy, Fran, Joyce, you come in, you can stay if you want." They were the wives of the 3 who slept with Carol. Seeing her, all 3 nodded and entered, standing next to her. "One at a time, girls. Take your bags and leave," Neil said again. The other 2 took turns taking their bags and leaving. All this took just a few seconds. Neil turned to the 3 he had let in. "You 3, take your bags and change in the bathroom." They nodded and went to change clothes. Neil was tired, but knew he needed to deal with Carol. She was still standing in the middle of the room. Whenever he looked at her, she smiled at him until he frowned. Betty, sitting on the bed, shook her head in disgust. "If you don't want to hit her, why is she still here?" asked Betty. Neil turned to Betty with sad eyes. She gasped and nodded. "I'm silent. If you don't want to hit her, I'll do it for you," Betty said softly. Neil shook his head. He needed to think. He began to walk around the room. "Carol, come here and sit next to me," Betty said. Carol looked at her friend with a scared look on her face and shook her head. "I promise not to hit you unless Neil tells me," Betty said, patting the spot next to her. Carol slowly walked over and sat down next to Betty. The other 3 women came out of the bathroom. They were all wearing t-shirts and shorts. They joined Betty on the bed, but avoided Carol. Fran was crying, Joyce was sobbing, and Lucy looked like she was ready to kill someone until Betty whispered in her ear. Then she just shook her head. "If you're hungry, there's food and drink on the table," Betty told the 3 wives. They quietly got up and went to get something to eat and drink. Carol was about to get up too, but Betty held her back. "Not you, bitch," Betty said sternly. Carol pulled away from Betty and sat quietly. Neil continued to walk, thinking. "Lucy, I assume you've already told Steve off for what he did," Neil asked. "Oh yeah, I told that son of a bitch he shouldn't be home when I get back. Fortunately, my mother has the children. I called her and told her that under no circumstances should she let Steve go with the children. I had to tell her what he did. She's furious. And you, Fran? Neil asked. Fran stopped crying. He knows he shouldn't come home until I call him. I only came here to pick up my things and change clothes. But since she's here, Fran pointed at Carol, I want to grab a piece of her ass before I go. Carol gasped. Neil nodded. Betty giggled. Joyce? Neil asked. This isn't the first time. Well, he cheated on me before. I was stupid and forgave him, but not this time. Now he knows that he is out of my life forever. God, I'm so sorry, Carol cried. Shut up, Neil shouted. Carol cowered, covering her face with her hands. I'm sorry you found out this way, Joyce, Fran, and Lucy, but they slept with my future wife. They were supposed to be my friends. Not only did this bitch betray me, but 3 of my friends did too. Neil continued to walk. From time to time, he would go to the food table and grab something to eat. 3 women looked at him. If you want to leave, you can. Don't stay here for me, Neil said. No, I'll stay, said Lucy. Me too, Fran said. Me too, Joyce giggled. I want to know what will happen to her next. Joyce pointed at Carol. Well, until Neil refused to marry her, and her mother kicked her out of the house. Of course, this may change. Not so much as far as the wedding is concerned. I think Neil is done with that. No, Carol sang softly, tears flowing from her eyes. Neil looked at Carol. She crawled back onto the bed until she was pressed against the headboard. She was still crying. Carol, you need help. If only you could tell me what happens when you drink, I could help. I know, God, now I know. I thought I had it under control. We never drank. I do not drink. You know me. Okay, whatever. You didn't drink while we were dating. Why were you drinking at your bachelorette party? I didn't drink, honestly, Carol said. You know, she didn't really drink while I was there, Betty said. When did you leave? Neil asked. About 2 o'clock in the morning. Actually, we all left around this time, didn't we, girls? I went with you, Betty, said Lucy. I left with you too, Joyce added. And me too. I think most of the girls left then, Fran said. What happened when they left, Carol? Neil asked. Carol sat and thought. She shook her head and continued to think. I remember the doorbell rang. I went to open it and Steve, Bill, and Mark were there. They all looked at me with lust. I was so tired. I don't know why I let them in. They gave me some kind of alcoholic soda drink. I thought it was just soda. It was delicious. I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened it, Steve was pulling his hand away from my drink. I didn't think much of it. Until now, Carol said, crying. Oh God, that son of a bitch. That still doesn't justify you. You should have told me when I asked about your past, Neil shouted. I said, well, the parts that I remember, I need to know how you got this video, Carol asked. Someone sent it to me. It was an anonymous email. She was only active enough to post a video, then disappeared. Steve isn't smart enough to do that. Hey, Lucy said. Well, he's smart enough not to send his part, so someone else did it, not Steve. Lucy nodded. I sent this, Betty said boldly. What? Carol said. Why not? I told you to tell him, didn't I? You should have told him. You two would be drinking at a reception and you'd turn into a bitch right in the middle of it. I did this to save you both from each other. What? Carol said. You should have just told me, Betty. You are her friend. I would listen to you and help her. I know. Sorry, Carol. You fucking bitch. Did you ruin my wedding? No, you did it yourself. What I want to know is how did Steve and the others find out? Neil asked. Lucy covered her face with her hands. Oh my God. I just remembered that I told Steve about Carol a long time ago. Crap. Sorry. Damn, what an idiot I am, Lucy cried. Well, Neil began. I'm so sorry, Carol said. Carol, be quiet, Neil said. You know, if I had known this before the wedding, I could have helped protect you from those bastards. But like any addict, you thought you knew better. Crap, Neil shouted at the end in frustration. Carol huddled on the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Betty, Lucy, Joyce, and Fran also flinched at Neil's scream. Neil just stood there, looking at Carol with disappointment in his eyes. "Well, one thing's for sure," Neil said and fell silent. "What?" Carol asked. "You'll go to rehab and then join Alcoholics Anonymous." "What?" Carol whispered. "Do you still want to marry me?" Neil shouted. "If she doesn't want to, I'll go out," Betty said quietly. Neil's head turned towards her. The surprised look on his face made Betty giggle. "I thought you knew," she said. "I kept telling Carol that if she wasn't careful, I would steal you from her." "Come here, Betty," Neil said softly. Betty stood up, walked over, and stood in front of Neil, looking into his eyes. Neil reached out his hand, placed it on the back of Betty's head, and pulled her lips to his. Betty's arms wrapped around his neck, and she moaned into his mouth. Neil groaned, wrapping his arms around her and holding her close. Her body seemed pleasant to him in his arms. He just needed to see if she was serious or just teasing him. He put his hand on her chest. She gasped, but didn't push him away. "Neil, Betty," Carol screamed. None of them stopped. Carol then began to pull on Neil. He turned to face her. He picked her up by the waist and threw her on the bed. She screamed. Betty laughed. Betty was now hanging on Neil's arm, ready to carry out his every order. "I'm ready to do whatever you want," Betty whispered in his ear. Neil nodded. He turned to the other 3 women in the room. "You can leave now or help me get my first dose of revenge. Not just Carol, but your husband's too. If you agree, undress and climb onto the bed. I will have sex with you. And to get back at Carol, I'll have sex with Betty. If you do this, it's all over between us," Carol screamed. Neil laughed. "It's already over, you stupid bitch. You arranged this last week." Neil turned to Betty and kissed her again. She moaned and clung to him. Carol couldn't believe her eyes. Her 3 friends began to undress and climb onto the bed. Carol quickly climbed off the bed and headed towards the door. Fran screamed. Neil beat her to the door. He stood looking at Carol and shaking his head. He grabbed her hand and pulled her towards a chair. He looked around and found what he was looking for, Carol's stockings. He picked them up, threw Carol into a chair, and tied her up with stockings. She screamed at him. "Let me go." Neil took off his shoe, pulled off his sock, and stuffed it into Carol's mouth. He found another stocking and tied it around her mouth to keep the sock inside. Then he looked at the bed. No wonder Carol's eyes were so big. There were 4 naked women lying on the bed, looking at him. He smiled. "God, you're all so beautiful," he said, taking off his clothes. "Who's first?" Neil asked. The women looked at each other. Lucy then moved towards Neil. They started having sex. Carol didn't look anymore. She closed her eyes. Tears continued to flow from them. Betty looked at her friend. At first she felt sorry for her. Then she remembered Carol sleeping with someone other than her fiancé and thought that what she was going through was deserved. Betty quickly returned to watching Neil and Lucy. "Wow," Lucy said as Neil finally pulled away from her lips. "That was so sexy," Neil said, smiling at Lucy. "Thank you, Neil." "You are a great lover," Lucy replied. Neil had sex with Lucy for a long time. He was angry, not at Lucy, but at Carol. Then he started having sex with the girls one by one. Betty was the last one. Neil gently rolled off Betty and lay down next to her. He smiled and breathed heavily. Betty smiled and was also breathing heavily. What she felt was the best sex of her life. Neil was surprised too. Was it better than with Carol? He couldn't tell until he had sex with all 3 women again, and then Carol. Something he really didn't want to do, at least not right now. "How could you?" Carol screamed. "Easy," Neil said. Betty laughed, as did the other 3 women. "I wasn't talking to you, bastard. I talked to Betty." "Easily. I lay down and he made love to me tenderly," Betty said. Even Neil chuckled at that. "Bitch," Carol screamed. "Treasonous," Betty shouted back. All the girls giggled except Carol. She just sat there with a frown on her face. She was actually disgusted by Neil for what he had just done, even though she had done the same thing behind his back. If it weren't for Betty returning home, she might have hidden what she did. Everyone was talking except Carol. A knock on the door interrupted them. Neil stood up and looked through the peephole. What he saw surprised him. "Hey, Beth," Neil said, opening the door wide. Beth's eyes widened as Neil walked out and gently took her hand. He carefully pulled her into the room and closed the door. "Sorry. I thought you'd be alone. I interrupted you," Beth muttered. "Not at all. We taught Carol a lesson. Come in and join us." "Mom, what the hell are you doing here?" Carol growled. "Watch your tongue, young lady," Beth growled back as she approached Carol. "Why is she tied up?" Beth asked, turning to Neil. "So she doesn't run away while we're busy," Neil said, extending his hand to Beth. When Neil touched Beth, she trembled. As she turned into his arms, she sighed. When Neil kissed her lips, she almost fainted. Standing next to Carol, they kissed for a long time. "Mother!" Carol shouted. Neil pulled his lips away from Beth's. "Do you want to be gagged again?" he growled. "No. What are you going to do with it?" Carol asked, nodding towards her mother. "Whatever she wants me to do to her," Neil said. Just for show, Neil put his hand on Beth's chest. Beth moaned, but did not remove his hand. Carol's eyes widened as her mother looked at her, lust filling her eyes and face. "Seeing how you screwed up so badly, now I can live out the fantasy I've had since you first started dating Neil," Beth said, placing her hand on Neil's arm and pressing it tighter to her chest. Carol simply turned her head and started crying again. Her own mother was about to have sex with her ex-fiancé. Even though she didn't really think of him as her ex, she knew he was. She lost it the second she tasted the alcohol and the soda Steve gave her. She knew what would happen, and she liked the thought of what she would do. After all, she was a libertine at heart. Beth and Neil walked over to the bed. They kissed again. Neil slowly undressed Beth. As every part of her body was shown, Neil gasped at her beauty. She was as beautiful as her daughter, only more mature, and don't grow up the same way. More sophisticated would be a better word. "Oh my God, you're beautiful," Neil breathed as she stood naked before him. "Thank you, Neil." They started having sex. Neil just lay there and wondered if, after tonight and tomorrow, he would ever be able to bring these five together with him again. When the ladies finished, they all stood up and took drinks and food from the table. Neil walked over to the chair Carol was sitting in and untied her. He helped her to her feet and walked over to the refreshments table. She didn't say a word or move away from him. Neil left her to her own devices, grabbed a snack and a beer, and went and sat on the bed with the rest of the guests. Beth sat next to him on one side and Betty on the other. The other three women sat on one side of the bed and chatted. Neil simply sipped his beer, taking a bite of what he took from the table. Carol came into his sight. She had a soda, which she sipped as she paced back and forth in front of him. Neil barely paid her any attention. Beth, however, took notice. "Carol, sit down," she said sternly. "No, Mom," Carol replied, continuing to walk. Betty was about to say something, but stopped, looking around at everyone. She set her beer down and slowly stood up and walked over to Carol. Carol stopped when Betty blocked her path. "What?" Carol was indignant. "Take off your clothes," Betty ordered. "Damn it, bitch," Carol screamed. Betty raised her hand and grabbed Carol's shirt and pulled hard. It tore at the front. Betty ripped off her bra. The other three women ran up to Carol and began tearing off the rest of her clothes. Neil sat holding Beth. He shook his head in her direction. They both relaxed and watched as Carol's clothes were torn off. When she was completely naked, Betty pushed her and Carol fell to the floor, crying. The other four women stood over her, looking down angrily. "Ladies, please leave her alone," Neil said softly. All four women looked at him, nodded, and returned to their seats. Carol looked at Neil with tears in her eyes. She looked at her mother, who just frowned. Carol sat with her head down and her face in her hands, crying. Neil stood up and walked towards her. Suddenly, he felt that she had suffered enough. He gently picked her up and carried her to the bed, gently laying her down on the mattress. Carol looked at him, expecting something other than kindness. Leaning down, he kissed her forehead. Looking into her eyes, he sadly shook his head. Then he nodded and stood up. "Ladies, please get dressed and go home." Carol and I have things to discuss. Beth, as her mother, you can stay, but for the sake of my sanity, please get dressed. Do you want me to stay too? Asked Betty. Neil walked up to Betty, hugged her, and kissed her passionately. Betty kissed him back, but knew he wanted her to leave too. When they broke the kiss, she gathered her clothes and got dressed. Stay there, he told Carol as she tried to get out of bed. Shaking with fear, she lay back on the bed, looking at Neil. Once the ladies were dressed, they lined up in front of Neil to kiss him goodbye. They stood shoulder to shoulder as he turned to them. Ladies, I want to thank you for a wonderful evening. I had a great time. Hopefully we can get back together again, Neil said. Walking up to Fran, he kissed her tenderly. She kissed back. I will be glad to see you at any time, either alone or in company, she whispered quietly in his ear. He looked at her in surprise. She nodded, turned around, picked up her bag, and walked towards the door. He walked up to Joyce. Pressing his lips to hers, he hugged her, and she kissed him deeply. Anytime, anywhere, just call me, I'll be there, Joyce whispered. Walking away from Neil, she picked up her bag and walked over to Fran at the door. Lucy hugged him as she kissed him, taking your lips away from his. What did they say? But if you don't call me, I will find you and find you. You will definitely enjoy what I do to you, Lucy said loudly. He then kissed Betty passionately. When they broke the kiss, she leaned in to whisper in his ear, like they said, anytime, anywhere, I'm yours to do whatever you want with me. Seriously. Neil gasped but nodded at her. She winked at him and picked up her bag. She walked to the door, opened it, and led the others out. Neil found his clothes and put them on. Beth sat on the bed next to her daughter. She spoke quietly to Carol. Beth was dressed, which Neil was glad about. Neil went into the bathroom and took the robe that was hanging outside the door. He brought it to Carol. She smiled at him, but he only frowned as he handed her the robe. Get up and put this on, Neil said. Carol did as she was told. Beth, I told Carol that she would be going to rehab on Monday morning. Could you come with us? My pleasure, Neil, Beth replied. Are you really going to take me to rehab? Carol asked in surprise. Yes, Carol. I don't hate you. I just hate what you hid from me and what you did last week. It stopped me from marrying you, but it didn't stop me from loving you, even though I should have. But I received an epiphany from a very smart and wise woman, Neil said. Yes? From whom? Carol asked with sarcasm in her voice. From me, you stupid bitch, Beth said softly. What? Your father looks like you. In fact, you probably inherited this from him. He's the male equivalent of a bitch. Your sister Emily is like that too, but she's lucky enough to marry a man who likes her to be like that. I loved your father when he cheated on me. Why did you stop loving him? Carol asked. Why? When he started using me as a punching bag instead of a sex toy, Beth said sadly. I don't remember him hitting you. You were little, he waited for you to fall asleep. The only one who saw him hit me was your older sister Terry. She took a baseball bat and almost killed your father. Then the guy she was dating was at our house when your father started beating me. He pulled your father away from me and kicked him out of the house for the night. After a few more times, I just called the police. Since then, he has been almost a saint. I've been enjoying life with other men for the last 10 years. I still love that asshole, but now that you're all out of the house, I'd leave him in a heartbeat if he hit me again. Beth sat looking at her daughter. Carol's jaw dropped and her eyes widened in surprise. And what do you mean by that? Carol asked. I told Neil that no matter what you have done or will do, he will still love you. And when his anger and disgust pass, he will still want you. And if he helps you, you can become the woman he thought you were. But if he decides to marry you after all and discovers that you have become bad again, I suggest that he always count on me to help him survive your bouts of naughtiness. Mother? Carol asked furiously. What? He doesn't have the right to have others while you do this? Asked Beth. Carol didn't say anything. She just looked at her mother with fury in her eyes. You can look at me like that all you want, but the truth is still the truth, Beth said. And every one of your friends knows it too. Even if they stay with their husbands, there will be changes, and they will sleep with whoever they want from now on, Neil said softly. So even if I give up booze and other men and you take me back, you'll still sleep with other women. How long? Carol asked. I don't know if I will or not, but just so you know, this is an option that I can use at any time that can help you stay on track, Neil said. But if your mother wants me, what can I say? She will be my mother-in-law, and I have to do what she says. Isn't it? Oh God, Carol moaned. What about Betty? She's your best friend who I absolutely adore. Who knows, you might like it if she joins us in bed once in a while or always, Neil said, laughing. Carol just groaned, covering her face with her hands. Hell, I might join you and Betty in bed sometimes, Beth croaked. Oh God, Carol moaned. Oh, by the way, your sister Emily wants to have sex with Neil, Beth said, laughing at Carol. Nonsense. That bitch better stay away from my Neil, Carol screamed. Your Neil? Neil asked. You're mine until you say you're not. You are Carol asked angrily. Perhaps in your imagination. Niall, Beth interrupted. Yes, Beth? You know you'll get her back anyway, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here talking. Neil cleared his throat. The look on Carol's face was not only surprising, but also love. Beth simply held Neil's hand. Beth went out to get something to eat, and Neil and Carol had sex. They looked at each other. Neil looked at her with anger. Carol looked at him with surprise and love. I love you, she croaked. Yeah, I saw how much you loved me, Neil said, shaking his head. Will you ever let me forget this? Someday, maybe, but not soon. You should have told me. Oh God, now I know it. Please forgive me for being such a fool, Carol begged. Forgive me. Someday. Forget. Never. Will you forget what I did today? Forget? No. Forgive? I have already forgiven you if you never sleep with them again. It can be difficult. You will be in rehab. I will be alone without sex. And we are not married. Oh shit. You bastard. You should have told me, but you knew better, so I'll sleep with your girlfriends until you get out of rehab, and then we'll get married, Neil said. Are you going to marry me? As soon as you get clean and start seeing a therapist, I will marry you. I still love you, you stupid fool, but what you did without telling me about your problem hurts. It was very painful. My heart still hurts for what you did. Oh God, I'm so sorry. My heart hurts too. I saw your face when you had them, every one of them. And then my mother. Oh my God, Carol said, covering her face with her hands. A knock on the door interrupted them. Guess who? Neil said, standing up and walking towards the door. Oh my God, Carol said, looking at the door. Neil opened the door and Beth walked inside. She smiled at Neil. So, he's taking me back, but you can never sleep with him again, Carol said quickly. Nonsense, Neil shouted. You should also stop lying. Carol covered her face with her hands. Beth simply shook her head as she walked towards her naked daughter. Carol, you can't build a relationship on lies, only truth and honesty. This is why my relationship fell apart. Your father lied to me all the time. Now that you and Neil are back together, she looked over her shoulder at Neil. He nodded. I will divorce your father. He will remain your father, but will no longer be my husband. Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry for you and for him, Carol sobbed, looking into her mother's eyes. And I feel sorry for you, my dear daughter. What you did, it could have been avoided, and I wouldn't be sitting here wishing my ex-husband would have sex with me, and I'm going to do it with him again before I leave tonight. Mom, no, please, Carol screamed. It's up to Neil, Beth said, looking at Neil. Neil just stood there. Smiling wickedly, he pulled Beth into his arms. Carol's eyes widened as Neil kissed Beth hard on the lips. Carol cried, covering her face with her hands. Can I go home? Carol asked. No, Neil shouted, pushing Beth away. Neil was very angry, but he loved the woman who caused him so much pain. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was repaying her. Not completely, but maybe enough for today. He decided that was enough for today. Beth, you can stay, but I'm done for today. I'm going to take Carol downstairs to get something to eat, and then we'll come back here to bed. In the morning, I will take her to the rehabilitation center and leave her there. I'll call you when I get home, Neil said. Okay, my dear boy, I'll be waiting for your call. If we ever get back together, and I'm not saying we will or won't, you must never mention it to Carol as long as you live. Neil winked at Beth so Carol couldn't see. Fine. I won't be able to rub her nose in this if we get together. I can live with this. And you? I can, Neil replied. I can't, Carol said, crying. You'll never know unless I tell you. And I'm a much better liar than you, Neil said. Carol lowered her head as her mother and Neil kissed at the door. She loved him so much and knew she had made a big mistake. For the next few weeks, she would be in rehab, and Neil would have her friends and his mother. She shuddered at the thought. She knew she deserved everything he did. Get dressed, Neil said. She nodded, looking around. Her mother left without saying goodbye. She shook her head and put on her skirt. Her underwear was torn, so she just put on the skirt without it. When she found her blouse, it was also torn. Neil pulled out one of his t-shirts and tossed it to Carol. She put it on and stood waiting. Neil smiled at her. No underwear, bitch? He asked. It was there, but it was torn, Carol said, pointing to the floor. Neil laughed as he buttoned his pants and put on his shirt. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Neil wrapped his arms around Carol, pressing her soft body against his. She sighed and hugged him back. I love you, she whispered. I know, but not enough to tell me about your problem, right? Excuse me. Shut up. I know you're sorry. I know that you love me. I know that I love you. I want you to be in my life for the rest of my days, but only after you are reborn, Neil said softly. I'll try my best, honestly. And that's one more thing. If I catch you lying, we'll break up. But you would never lie to me. I will never lie to you. I may not answer your questions, but I won't lie. Then it's the same for me. No, you will answer all my questions honestly and completely. Do you understand, dear? Neil barked. But I can't stand it, Neil barked. If you don't like it, we don't have to get married. I want to marry you, I love you. But isn't that what you're doing with double standards? Yes, you're damn right. But I'm not the one who cheated with friends. I told you I was going to cheat with you. You lied to me. You cheated on me. That's why your rules are stricter than mine. Carol lowered her head. She nodded to show she understood and looked at Neil. You are hungry? Neil asked. Carol's stomach growled in response. She giggled. Neil chuckled, took her hand, and pulled her towards the door. Carol was in rehab for 2 months. Neil had multiple encounters with each of the 5 women that night. The day before Carol left rehab, Neil invited all 5 of them for a day and night of debauchery. He smiled when he picked Carol up the next morning. She never asked, and he never told her. Carol and Neil got married in a very small ceremony in a church. The only people present were her mother, father, 2 sisters, Betty, Fran, Joyce, Lucy, and Neil's parents. The reception took place at a local restaurant in a private room. It was just dinner and drinks. No dancing, no real fun. Carol drank soda all night, as did Neil. About 6 months after the wedding, Carol called Betty. They talked for a long time. Carol invited her to dinner on Saturday. After dinner, Carol and Betty had sex with Neil until they were exhausted. It became a weekly event. Carol soon began inviting the other 4 women. She fell in love with them all and realized that she enjoyed having sex with her friends as much as they did. About once a month, Neil said he needed to stay late at work. Carol never asked him about it, and he never told her anything. They were happy in their marriage and the way it looked in the future. They loved each other, and that was the main thing for them. End.